Alex, describe the main contention of the book.
We're basically arguing kind of a very broad point using a lot of kind of background documentary evidence, essentially that the Taliban and Al Queda are distinct groups with distinct goals, histories, ideologies, and so on. And we go back all the way to the 1960s, 1970s to explore essentially how these groups developed in different ways, in different places, with different age groups and so on of different generations, and show eventually how they kind of came to kind of coalesce together, at least in one place in Afghanistan in the late 1990s. Then looking at obviously the 9/11 moment when essentially at least in part in the kind of public consciousness, the two were kind of seen as
one
fused together, and then looking at how this has developed since then, both in terms of how people react to the Taliban and Al Queda on the basis of this understanding, and then how what the reality is now. So essentially, we're trying to unpack a bit of this history and the relationship.
And the Taliban came from the Deobandi tradition of Islam. Describe that.
Well, of course, this is a tradition going back hundreds of years to the 19th century. In fact, in India, in the great madrasa in Deoband, which was instrumental in South Asia in kind of forging a unified tradition in a way, which people would study in Deoband and they would come back to what is now known as Pakistan and Afghanistan, and teach it in madrasas and so on. It's a traditionalist school, which based on a very kind of close reading of scripture and the hadith collections. And if you look at the things that people are learning in their madrasa, at least in the kind of the ideal version of the Deobandi syllabus, I guess. They're studying the Quran, they're studying the hadith, they're studying the kind of cultural adjuncts to those traditions which kind of came out in Islam. Now that what we have at the moment is you could argue what's being taught in Pakistan and so on in the madrasas is quite different from that ideal version. But I mean in the 1960s and the 1970s, it was a lot more balanced than it came to develop into.
How did that differ from the kind of Islam that the key members of Al Queda were studying?
I think there are several things you need to consider if you look into the traditions of where Al Qaeda came from, or the individuals who later came to form Al Qaeda, and the individuals which came together and formed the Taliban, or were Taliban in the 80s, fighting against Suez, and later on became the movement. Really, the Al Qaeda came out of the Middle East, which was very much in touch with the Western world, which had been colonized, which had a lot of streams of different national experiments, so to say, between Pan-Arabism and Pan-Islamism, and sort of out of these universities grew these ideologies that are often rooted back to influential and key thinkers like Sayyid Qutb from Egypt. I think some of the main differences in a way is that the Deobandi school and the sort of like upbringing of the Taliban, coming from rural areas in southern Afghanistan, where we still see a huge mix of local customs and culture with Islam in a way, with often a quite influential element from Sufism. And around these things you see huge differences in terms of where Al Qaeda comes from, or how their ideology developed, and where the Taliban are at. A lot of the traditions that the Taliban would have followed early on, or still do follow, are traditions Al Qaeda would see to be non-Islamic. And particularly, in southern Afghanistan, if you walk around, you go to the villages, you often would find local shrines. You would go to the graveyards and you would feel, you would see flags and so forth. For all of these traditions are sort of come out of local traditions and out of Sufism, of holy man traditions, which are all straightforward rejected from Al Qaeda, and the sort of ideologies coming out of these streams of thought.
And as they began to put the ideologies into practice, you use the terms near war and far war. Describe what you mean by that.
It's the near war, the far war, the near enemy, and the far enemy. This goes back on like a central thought of where Al Qaeda bases its worldview on, in a way, where the near enemy really is the local governments. It's the governments in Egypt, the governments in Saudi Arabia, around the Middle East, where a lot of the individuals who came to join Al Qaeda or formed Al Qaeda were in different militant groups before that, who were fighting against their own governments. So this was sort of the traditional militant Islamism, fighting against one's own government. With Al Qaeda, and a lot of other groups during that time frame, actually, there was a redefining of why do we have the near enemy, and we have the near enemy of these governments because they get external support. And that external support comes from Western nations, headed off mostly for a lot of people, specifically for Al Qaeda, by America, the United States of America, who lent their support to the various governments in order for various ends and reasons. So that became the far enemy, and the far enemy sort of united a lot of different streams of thought for people, and that was sort of the redefining. Something which also sets them quite apart from the Taliban.
To start with, the Taliban were not really a political or religious movement. How did that come about? How was the movement formed?
Really, the movement started as we know it in 1994 in southern Afghanistan and in districts around Kandahar city. And really, it really came out of the situation of southern Afghanistan. In the early 1990s, there was a chaotic and anarchy, in a way, to be found in southern Afghanistan. The various Mujahideen commanders and militias that had been put in place by the Afghan government to kind of had fallen into war with each other and into war with the local government, local population, extracting money. There was widespread case of rape and so forth. And the Afghan Taliban came together out of that situation, trying to push back on these commanders in a very real sense. And they came together very much in the same groups they had fought against the Soviets in southern Afghanistan together. So there were individuals like Mullah Muhammad Omar who had fought as a small commander in the same areas. They later on came together and they started to push back on these commanders, these rogue commanders, and got a lot of support early on, not just from the local population, but also from people like Ahmed Shah Massoud, who early on supported the Taliban with money and actually air support. And then other people like international Pakistan very early on lended support because the Taliban, while were very successful early on, but sort of stood for something that had the potential to unite Afghanistan in their mind. So that was sort of like the beginning, but also already the first changes from being a local in the group that just took care of a stretch of road from being supported by governments and other influential military leaders to then falling in war with most of them again.
So once they become a political and religious movement, in those early days, what was their view of the world?
What was their view of the world? I mean, I think it's anyone's guesswork, really, what their early thoughts were. But given their background and given where they were brought up, their education, the situation in southern Afghanistan in the 70s, access to news. If you have to think that in the early 70s, there were 2 newspapers in southern Afghanistan, both governmental, both only distributed to people who worked for the government in print run of 900. There weren't a lot of radios around. Only very rich individuals in the city could afford a radio, and some of the tea houses would have a radio, who were mostly turned to music back in the time. So really their idea of the world was very, very limited. They had no real
contact with the world.
No real contact in the world in a very real sense, and no real contact with a lot of the problems they would face early on with international diplomacy here and so forth. They really were very limited in their understanding what the world was about.
And After the Mujahideen had driven the Soviets out of Afghanistan, a second war began between the different factions. Describe the main players in that war and what they were trying to do.
Yeah, in the early 1990s, of course, the Najib government was still holding on to power, more or less with the help of an extensive kind of network of militias which had been set up around the country, much the same as the Americans are doing now. And that held until 1992. At that point, the Mujahideen took over the country, and essentially things split into kind of more localized zones. So in the south, it was a kind of network of Mujahideen commanders who took certain places and certain areas in Kabul. It was a similar kind of thing.
So a patchwork quilt of different areas of support.
Yes, nominally you had, Rabbani, who was recently assassinated. He was president, and then, technically that was going to be a power-sharing agreement between various people, and then it would shift over after a few months to Mujahideen and so on. And all of this, it was quite, very difficult to put together, and there was a kind of lot of outside mediation from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia to try and force people together and agree on, who would get what position. But in the south, at least, I mean, it was as the saying goes to this day, every man was a king. A certain neighborhood would have a certain commander controlling it.
And Al Qaeda at this point were pretty much horrified by this kind of struggling between individuals and commanders and factions.
Indeed, I mean, horrified. I don't know. There definitely was a feeling of a lot of, not just about the individuals who were in Qaeda, which really in the early 90s was still nothing like an organization. It was just a group of people who had come together and threw around a few ideas. But there were a lot of other, what came to be known the Afghan Arabs, and there was a huge influx actually of foreigners who got trained and so forth in these early 1990s. And what had been a very clear and straightforward jihad against an infidel invading force, the Soviet Union coming to an Islamic country, Afghanistan, getting pushed back, and a jihad had become a messy civil war between Muslims. So for a lot of the people, the reasoning, the fatwas which had been issued to support this jihad became very difficult to do. Who do you support if Muslims fight against each other? So a lot of these individuals didn't really know how to place themselves anymore, and that's also the time frame where we see a lot of them actually leaving Afghanistan and not taking part in this internal struggle anymore.
And indeed bin Laden left and went back to Saudi Arabia at this point.
Yes, bin Laden left to Saudi Arabia to this point. He had a small part, or it's been said that he tried to negotiate between a few fractions inside the civil war which was developing in Afghanistan. Moved on and relocated himself after quite a massive falling out was in Saudi Arabia and the House of Saud to Sudan, and started to get all the people who had initially signed up to Al Qaeda or had formed Al Qaeda and others to come and join him in Sudan. And Sudan, pursuing an open door policy towards basically all Islamist groups. It was very welcoming. It was very easy for people to go there, no matter what you did beforehand. And a lot of the individuals who had come to fight in Afghanistan couldn't actually return to their home countries because they were on wanted lists. They might have been already trialed in absentia. So a lot of them came to Sudan, and there were various different groups set up there trying to achieve very different aims. And Osama bin Laden was still one amongst many back then. And he's said to have kept his open lines of communication with Afghanistan and still would send support to various guest houses he established or had run in Pakistan and so forth, but he really wasn't much involved in what was happening in Afghanistan.